he was talking about. The story is you should hold back. You should hold back. In the civilized world, isn't it true? Is it true? Well, take a look. They're building a culture to encourage international terrorism. The disease of the change. Hold back. Nothing will hold up the disease of the change. Hold back. Nothing will hold up back. One by one, the disease of the
And welcome
change.
back to All Health Can't Stop Us. I'm Jeff Cliff, and this is my record of what went on in the world, my podcast, my blog, my recording for you to enjoy, to remix, to share with your friends, to link to on your blogs, your Facebook, your Fediverse accounts, you name it, you can do it. And this is an alternative to many other things which you can hear about in other shows. But today, as promised, I do have a little bit of music. The first one is going to be a really kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like a really groovy tune, I think. This is Kevin MacLeod's Acid Trumpet. So hopefully this comes through okay, and we're going to cut into that right away. And that was, again, Acid Trumpet by Kevin MacLeod. It seemed to come through a little quiet on my end, so hopefully it wasn't too quiet over on the internet, but I'll try to mix that in for the final version of this a little bit louder. And then the other one is not originally a Creative Commons tune. However, if you look at the original terms of distribution, you can actually include it in things like this. It says to share with your friends, and well, I guess that's what I'm doing here. I might have a lot of friends. Anyone who's listening to this is probably a friend of mine. But yeah, this was released on an album. It was actually one of the first major artists to try this kind of new model of sharing music online, and that is, of course, Harvey Danger. Well, here, Cream and Bastards Rise. That's kind of one of my favorite albums. That whole album is just filled with good stuff. It was, again, Harvey Danger with Little by Little was the album that it was on, which I'm pretty sure you can still buy that. That, for sure, you can buy online. And it is one of the early parts of Free Culture, possibly even before the book Free Culture was published. This was something that was offered to the world. It's really a shame too, because if you listen to Harvey Danger's early stuff, they were actually pretty famous, and they had some hits, or at least one big hit. And the stuff on this album was way better. Like, they clearly matured as a band and as musicians during the late 90s and early 2000s before this was released, and yet they really didn't get credit for that, which is kind of a bit of a tragedy in the long term of things. But in any case, I did have a guest lined up, and unfortunately she is missing in action. So that kind of puts a little bit of a damper on things. But in the meanwhile, as usual, we have a couple of things to go through. The first is, let's see here, if I can load this up, from Can Lee Connects, which is, I guess, Can Lee's news, maybe not news, but kind of like a blog. It's a blog. And what Can Lee is, by the way, is it's a Canadian version of another thing in the States. I can't remember what the LII stands for, but it's like Legal Information Library or Library of something. Anyway, it's a place, it's the de facto place that if you want to know what court cases have happened in Canada and what the outcomes were and what the arguments were and all that good stuff, you can go there. And CanLee is a huge search engine and reference site for people interested in the law and in case law, the outcome of court cases and even ongoing court cases. They'll have all kinds of good stuff. And so if you ever were curious about, you read the news and you hear, oh, somebody lost a lawsuit or some big court case was decided, you can actually go and read it in this country. And for the vast majority of cases, you'll be able to get access to exactly what the court case was. So for example, you can go and the Boucher case here in Saskatchewan, that would have been on CanLee. Like you could read it yourself and you can get the idea. Same thing with the provincial governments, like the government of Saskatchewan taking it to as high of court as they could to get the carbon tax overturned. Again, that you can go look that up and it's on CanLee and they have it. But in any case, this article specifically, quote, Supreme Court of Canada affirms access to habeas corpus for immigration detainees. Canada, Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness versus China. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. 2019 SEC, which is the Supreme Court of Canada, 29. Oh, probably the 29th session. I don't know, something like that. In any case, quote, the Supreme Court of Canada has breathed new life into the ancient writ of habeas corpus in a 6-1 decision affirming that detainees under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, PAWS, i.e. that was modified by C-51, unpause, are not barred from seeking review of their detention by way of habeas corpus. At issue in which, by the way, I wonder if I'm not pronouncing this Latin term right. Adam, I noticed, pronounced it slightly different. Habeas? It might be habeas. Anyway, continuing on. At issue in this appeal was whether an exception to the availability of habeas corpus in certain immigration contexts known as jurisprudence as the Piru exception, after a thorough examination of habeas corpus in the IRPA detention review scheme, a majority of the Supreme Court of Canada concluded that the IRPA scheme did not fall within the Piru exception. In so doing, the court has affirmed a line of recent appellate jurisprudence which has opened the door to superior courts for immigration detainees seeking access to habeas corpus to challenge their detention. The respondent, this guy, had challenged his detention under the IRPA under the grounds that it was of lengthy and uncertain duration, i.e. they arrested him and they're not letting him go, and they're not letting him actually be charged. Interesting. So for the purpose of this challenge, the majority concluded that IRPA detention review scheme was not, quote, as broad and advantageous, quote, as habeas corpus in at least 3 ways. First, the majority concluded that the onus on review was more favorable to the detainee on habeas corpus than it was under the IRPA. This is because under the IRPA, the scheme, the onus on the government is limited to demonstrating the presence of the statutory... Oh, I think we have our guest. Hold on. Maybe we will have a guest.
Hey, Jeff.
Hello, mystery guest. I am currently live on stream right now. So, mystery guest, is it okay if I call you Anonymous Nurse? Or is that how you would like to be known? Oh, are you off? I think we lost you. Hello? Oh, you are now off. Oh, too late. Oh, goodness. I have a feeling that was a time zone issue. In any case, where was I? In any case, the RPA scheme, the onus on the government is limited to demonstrating the presence of a statutory ground for detention, after which the onus shifts to the detainee to establish that continued detention would be unlawful by reason of its length and likely duration. Can't even tell. Okay, anyway, continuing. By contrast, under habeas corpus, once a detainee establishes legitimate ground to challenge detention, the onus shifts upon the government to justify the legality of the detention in any respect. In addition, under the RPA, the scheme, the government could satisfy the onus by relying on the reasons for ordering detention given at prior detention hearings. As a result, the IRPA scheme failed to provide the detainee with fresh and focused review
provided by habeas corpus where the government bears the onus. So, in other words, because the IRPA, and realistically the Anti-Terror Act, shifted the onus of review onto the person being charged, that kind of weakened the rights of the person, and in such a way that the Supreme Court of Canada is like, no, you can't weaken habeas corpus. You can only strengthen it. So, continuing on. Second, the majority concluded that the IRPA scheme was less advantageous than habeas corpus when it came to the scope of review available under the two mechanisms. Let's see here. A lot of legal gobbledygook, but it's basically the same as the first, where it's less advantageous than habeas corpus. So since the person being charged has habeas corpus rights, at least according to the Supreme Court of Canada, you can't kind of remove that. And then, quote, finally, the court concluded that habeas corpus offered an additional advantage for detainees by providing a more timely remedy than those available through the IRPA. In this regard, the court compared the long-standing recognition of habeas corpus as providing a swift and imperative remedy, as exemplified by the priority treatment of habeas corpus proceedings in many superior courts, to the lengthier process of judicial review available under the IRPA, in concluding that the timeliness of habeas corpus review offered an additional advantage that was not available under the immigration statute. It'll be binding to lower courts, and basically, so the law under C-51 was not as broad, not as advantageous as habeas corpus, and the Supreme Court sees fit to reiterate that, yes, we actually do have the habeas corpus right, and that even though the government of Canada, in terms of the executive and legislative branches, thought that, oh, maybe we can just get rid of these rights and legislate them away with C-51, at least in this particular case, i.e. people who are not citizens of Canada and who are just swept up and arrested without charge basically under the Immigration Act, they actually have the right to petition the government and say, why am I being arrested? If you're not going to charge me, let me go. And they are now going to have to do that. So either one, they're going to have to charge them, or two, let them go. That's kind of their choice here. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And this is recent too, like 2019, this is May 27, 2019, very recently. And secondly, it's very interesting that I haven't heard of this up until like this week, and was only hearing about it when researching for the rest of this video. So there was like no news coverage at all other than CanLII, which, I mean, CanLII's great to read, but I mean, I don't read it that often, and I mean, it's not something I've ever seen anyone link to this CanLII Connects before, so that's kind of interesting. So what else is going on? Okay, the second thing that's going on is I wanted to take a little bit of a step back to the Commission of Inquiry concerning certain activities of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, otherwise known as the MacDonald Commission, which was researched through 1979 through 1981, published in 1981. So pause, like I was born in 1982. This is ancient history as far as I'm concerned. This is the way the Canadian government and the RCMP worked as of before I came around, right? This is the context of the modern era. It is not the modern era as far as I'm concerned. However, if we go to, let's see, where did we go here? We try to get to chapter 7, and I have it here. I guess it's in reports 3, part 3. Must be in here somewhere. I don't know if we can see our screen. But if we go there and we zoom around, we try to get to chapter 7, because there's something interesting that happened in chapter 7. And this is actually like the source record, the best record of a couple of things that happened with the RCMP that caused the existence of CSIS and possibly CSEC as well. And that up until the point where this report was published, the intelligence gathering activities was predominantly the RCMP's responsibility. Like, it was just part of their job. And so they split up after this report some things that were to be done as far as regular policing was concerned, some things which were then going to be directed as part of maybe the government of Canada's NATO requirements or things like that, as far as surveilling on like the Soviet Union. That would have been the big enemy at the time that would have been sending agents to spy on Canadians and the Canadian government, and then maybe to do like counter-espionage and stuff like that. But in any case, there were a couple of incidents that happened during the 1970s, the late 1970s, which the RCMP got caught doing. And one of the things that they got caught doing was burning this barn down. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll go see what actually happened, right? Like when I can hear second and third accounts or third-hand accounts of it, but the closest documentation we should have is in this McDonald Commission report. And I've known about it for quite a while, and I've assumed that the account of this burning of a barn happened and would be there if I ever went and looked for it in the McDonald Commission report. However, if we actually go and check, this is what Chapter 7 says in the burning of a barn. Quote, "This chapter is not being published at this time. See the Commissioner's note which follows the introduction to Part 6. Well, where is it? Like, so this Part 6 here? Let's see here. And then they have like a little bit of a context of the history of the RCMP, the Second World War, 1960s, et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, it's not there. Like, we're almost 40 years later at this point. The RCMP have been reformed at least once in a major way, i.e. the creation of CSIS. And yet, this major part of Canadian history, i.e. the RCMP burning down a barn to keep two groups from meeting. One was the Front de Libération de Québec, the FLQ, and the other was the Black Panthers from the United States. The Black Panthers came up to meet the FLQ, and the RCMP didn't want, one, the oppressed people in Quebec finding common cause with oppressed African Americans in the States. That was terrifying to them. So when they found out where they were going to meet, the barn was burned down. And so that's, again, not something that was legal at the time. You can't have the police just decide, oh, we don't like these two groups, and we definitely don't want them working together, so we're just going to burn down a building, right? Like, can you imagine if they did that at, I don't know, like the downtown Saskatoon, the convention center, for example, and it's just, oh, it burned down. Why? Well, we don't know. The police investigated. They say they don't know what happened. The fire department investigates. They think the police department did it, right? Like it's ridiculous that that could have even happened, and yet it did, and it happened. It's a fact of Canadian history, and it's covered up. That chapter is just blank in our history, the best account of the history. So here's another account of it. This is kind of second or third hand, which is also interesting because this World Socialist website has come up a couple of times when I've been like looking for the history of CSIS. So by this time, the Solicitor General Sampson's admission about the APLQ operation triggered an investigation by the Quebec Justice Department and charges of, quote, failing to obtain a search warrant, which was another thing going on with that barn, apparently, that the barn was wiretapped all to hell, and the wiretaps were totally illegal. So anyway, continuing on. Failing to obtain a search warrant were laid against 3 police officers. Pausing again, can you imagine if we charge every single person at CSIS for failing to obtain a search warrant for everything they do? That would be hilarious. Anyway, continuing on. 1 each from the RCMP, the Quebec Provincial Police, and the Montreal Urban Community Police. All 3 officers pled guilty, but were then granted unconditional discharges by the court. This meant that not only could the officers in question return to work immediately without criminal records, but also that the RCMP succeeded in avoiding damaging public exposure of the details of their crimes. Again, these crimes that are still covered up, still blanked out from the McDonald Commission report. I actually contacted the Privy Council on this and sent them an email. They haven't responded yet, but we'll see if they actually do. It'll be interesting to see. Anyway, continuing on. Quote, then Solicitor General Francis Fox claimed that the APLU break-in was an, quote, isolated and exceptional, unquote, crime. In fact, it was neither isolated nor exceptional. By this time, the Solicitor General's office was already beginning to investigate charges of RCMP improprieties brought forward by 2 disgruntled Security Service employees, ex-Staff Sergeant Donald McCleary and ex-Sergeant Gilles Brunet, or Brunet? McCleary had been personally involved in the theft of dynamite and the burning down of a barn that was supposedly to host a meeting between the Black Panthers and the Front de Libération de Québec, the FLQ. McCleary and Brunet was also told the government about numerous cases involving illegal mill opening document theft, and even of the RCMP's, quote, participation and assistance to the Central Intelligence Agency in offensive activities in Canada, quote unquote. At this point, it was the RCMP itself that began to call for public inquiry. The RCMP argued that a federal commission would see the security service in a more favorable light than would the general public if cases arose one by one, sometimes in criminal proceedings. In other words, a public inquiry might offer a chance to restore public confidence in the security service at a time when the unfolding of the Watergate affair and the events in Vietnam, Chile, and elsewhere had drawn unwelcome attention to the dirty tricks of Western intelligence agencies. Which is exactly the point here. So the RCMP has a history, and CSIS along with it, since it was made by a lot of the same people, that involves doing illegal things. So that when we give them absolute power to do whatever they want, we should expect that, one, they're going to further abuse that power occasionally, that they won't stay within the bounds of the law because they've been able to get away with it, not doing so in the past, especially recently with the mass surveillance system, for example. And two, that if you do give them power to do things like, oh, I don't know, burning down a building, which again, C-51 gives the ability for them to do this legally, just like it was basically in the old days when they did it for the first time, or at least the first time that is on record with this FLQ Black Panthers event, that this is what we can expect them to actually do. You give them the ability to do something legally, they're going to do it, especially if they've done it in the past. So that's kind of an interesting bit of Canadian history that I wanted to kind of bring out, but it's really unfortunate that we can only bring it out so far. Like, I can link to this World Socialist website, and that's great. It's great that they have it, and I think their account of it is pretty much accurate, based on my memory of similar reports from other sources. However, they're not a great source. And if I was a conservative, I would just be like, whatever, socialist website, bullshit, right? I mean, it's not as good as the MacDonald Commission, for example, would have been. So really, people should be calling for this chapter to be unredacted. If it ever even still exists, does the original still have a copy somewhere? Is it in RCMP archives somewhere? Like, is there a freedom of information request we can request for this? I don't know. But I've started the search with this email to the Privy Council, so we'll see where that goes. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's actually kind of a movie that came out roughly around this time about the kinds of issues of why they were worried about kind of getting caught, and why that chapter might be redacted in the first place, because they were engaging in illegal wiretapping like crazy at the time. And it wasn't just the RCMP. I mean, the Americans were doing the same thing. The British were doing the same thing. Everyone who had access to audio tape equipment in terms of governments was doing it. Like, it wasn't like this was unknown at the time. It was just totally illegal. And people got off major crimes because of it. And there, as I mentioned, there's a movie about this. It is an MPAA movie. It is a little bit of an older one, so hopefully, I mean, don't buy this. Like, don't look for this on Netflix or anything like that. But if you can go pirate it, the Anderson tapes, which is a Sean Connery movie, actually kind of describes this very well. And the Anderson tapes is kind of a description of, or it's basically a fictionalized account of this guy who commits this really, kind of heinous crime. Right? I'm not going to go into the details of it. He's a hardened criminal. He commits a crime. And I won't go that far into it. But again, it's go and watch the movie. It's entertaining, unless you're totally boycotting the MPA, in which case don't break your boycott for this one. But still, it's interesting to look at this MacDonald Commission and to keep that kind of a movie in mind, because it kind of gives a little bit of flavor. So the other thing I wanted to do is I have this book that I bought from Elizabeth May herself when Elizabeth May was in Thunder Bay. And it's actually kind of like her autobiography. It's kind of like a description of both her political career and the issues in Canada that she finds important. And it's kind of like, almost like not quite a manifesto, but you could kind of think of it that way. And I wanted to read a little section of it, see if I can remember which page. So she's talking about her work to help deal with the ozone problem, which, by the way, like, I should probably actually mention this. There's an article on Slashdot today that says that even though there are examples of companies in China that are releasing CFCs into the atmosphere that are damaging the ozone, The ozone does slowly repair itself, and CFCs, although they take a long time to get out of the atmosphere, and they do a great deal of damage while they're up there, the Earth is still a pretty big place, and it gets bigger the further into the atmosphere you go. And so it's worth considering that, yes, you can do a little bit of damage, but the Earth has this ability, at least the atmosphere, to kind of heal. You can think of it as healing itself. It's more of an equilibrium between various chemical processes that happen at the top of the atmosphere level. But in any case, because of the actions we have taken as a world, thanks to the Montreal Protocol that Elizabeth May was involved with negotiating, we are well on track to actually having, by 2060, an ozone that is recovered, or at least that was the gist of it that I got from the Slashdot article. Anyway, let's see where I can start here. Quote, "We had the benefit of superb advice from one of the planet's brain trusts on environmental policy, Jim McNeill, a Canadian who had been Secretary General for the Commission and who had been the primary author of the seminal report, i.e. the WCED report, Our Common Future. He also had the intellectual and moral heritage of working in the early days of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF, and serving as deputy minister under Tommy Douglas, when Douglas was Saskatchewan's premier. On issue after issue, we brought forward policy designed to enhance our collective future. We listened to the Environment Canada scientists, and Tom McMillan went to the cabinet table as the advocate for the environment." Kind of like someone else that sounds familiar these days. Oh, we'll pause on that one. There is someone like that who I will keep trying to get on this show. But anyway, continuing on. He didn't always walk away from cabinet meetings with what he wanted, and we were often disappointed. And as a non-Tory, I had a hard time with policies in other areas. I, of course, being Elizabeth May. Continuing on. Nevertheless, the string of successes, especially in hindsight, was gobsmacking. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, a treaty to save the ozone layer, a cleanup plan for the St. Lawrence River, bans on lead and gas, and the herbicide Alacor, greater funding for environmental science, and national water policy, an approval of the first cleanup plan for toxic Sydney tar ponds, and more. The list is longer than I can include here. The efforts to enhance environmental protections were not solely federal, as provincial ministers of the environment engaged in a healthy rivalry to outdo each other and Tom McMillan in a race for the top. What is so striking now, nearly 30 years later, is that we were so much more advanced then. Parliament worked better. There was far more cross-party cooperation, and Prime Minister's office exerted almost no control over official statements and the actions of the department. In the conversations with other MPs, I often described what it used to be like. One of my friends in the Conservative caucus was astonished when I described how little control the PMO had over our public statements, and how often and effectively we cooperated across party lines. I told him how in the past parliamentary committees had been essentially nonpartisan. There were places where, like gunslingers leaving their guns with the sheriff at the edges of town, you parked your partisanship at the door. You rolled up your sleeves and looked at the bill in question with only one thought. Will this bill achieve its purpose? Can we make it better? I told my incredulous friend that the majority government of Brian Mulroney, one could even have called it, in the fashion of Harper's message management, quote, strong, stable, conservative majority government, though we didn't at the time, allowed its MPs to accept or reject amendments from the opposition parties based on whether they were good ideas. One example is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, and its use of priority substances lists. At first reading, CEPA did not have a priority substance list. It was an opposition idea. Tom McMillan liked it, and the amendments from the committee stayed in the bill. These days, under Stephen Harper, this was still under the Harper government, of course, but nothing's changed under the Trudeau government in this respect. Continuing on. Conservative MPs must ensure that bills passed unchanged from first reading to royal assent. No previous prime minister has established a nonsensical legislative process that rejects all amendments. Yet Stephen Harper seems to believe that suggested improvements to legislation are partisan efforts to wound him, efforts that must be resisted even if they merely correct drafting errors. And there were a couple of examples of this. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but a couple of them were widely reported that there were like typos in laws that made it really far into the process before being corrected, if they ever were. Quote, Stephen Harper achieved his majority. Improvements proffered in the legislative process have been rejected more than 90% of the time. Even drafting errors remain, only to be corrected in subsequent bills. My Conservative MP friend was astonished when I told him that I never ran the minister's speeches past the Prime Minister's office. Press releases, speeches, answers and question period, all were up to the minister to approve. The minister, not the PMO, not the Trudeau government. I.e., this is what things were like before Harper, before Trudeau, in the early parts of my life, for sure. We used to have this thing, this part of the way that our government worked, where ministers who were subject matter experts actually ran the policy of those subject matters. So anyway, continuing on. Quote, at my first year in office, Tom asked me if I could write speeches. Okay. So continuing on. Quote, I think he asked me the first time because his speechwriter was sick. I was never sure whether he liked my speeches better or just appreciated the bargain of getting both a speechwriter and a senior policy advisor for the price of one. But after one speech, I became his speechwriter. We had a great system. He would half dictate and half emote what he wanted to say in any given speech. I would take notes and then go off and write, squeezing, drafting the speech in among all of my duties, sometimes pulling all-nighters. A few days later, we would collaborate in a creative editing process that often went on until he was walking to the podium. These days, MPs find it almost impossible to believe. Like all ministers, the Minister of Environment was trusted to say what was on his mind. Nothing needed approval from the PMO. The same was true in the Martin and Chrétien administrations. It was obvious that approval from the Prime Minister was not needed by brilliant members of previous Liberal cabinets like Stephen Owen and John Godfrey, who gave erudite and witty speeches without a note in front of them. When I worked for Tom McMillan, there was also respect for the professionalism and competence of the federal civil service. Civil servants were not derided as, quote, bureaucrats or as useless ciphers. It was understood that the research and balance they brought to the table created better decisions. Prime Minister Mulroney paid attention to what his Minister of the Environment told him about science. It was in this atmosphere that I learned about climate change and the threat that it posed. And anyway, she goes on more about climate change and the policies. And in general, it's actually a pretty good book. If you do get a chance to read something this year, and if you haven't yet, especially before the election, see if you can find Elizabeth May's Who We Are, because it's well worth the read. But the point I wanted to bring out from this, though, is that Canada functioned differently in the past. We didn't have an all-powerful Prime Minister's office that controlled and micromanaged so many things on lower levels. And yes, you can disagree with many things the Trudeau and Harper government have done, but one of the deeply troubling things is this problem where not only have we, through laws like C-51, allowed the government to do things like threaten basic rights like habeas corpus, even if the Supreme Court just slapped them down on some of it. And not just the fact that we've given them the right to just carte blanche, do whatever they want, as long as they're not killing or raping us. And it's not just the smugness that the leader will kind of display when people with real problems, like, for example, the Grassy Narrows issue, are brought to them, and he just sort of brushes them off and laughs at them. But it's also this problem that we've allowed ourselves to be put into this situation where so much political power rests in a single person or a single office, the Prime Minister's office. I couldn't find the other quote in the book where she talks about it, but she does talk at some point, maybe not even in this book, about what the funding level was for the Prime Minister's office 30 years ago, 60 years ago, and today. In the past, the Prime Minister's office was just another minister. It was just another cabinet position. It was just, it was the head one, so the buck stopped there in a sense. But because power was so distributed throughout the various ministers of government, the office didn't have to be this big black box with a huge budget behind it that was unaccountable to everyone. And again, especially with a mass surveillance system attached, it wasn't the case 40 or 30 years ago that the Prime Minister's office had access to the private conversations of every Canadian
everyone else in the world possibly through the Five Eyes. This was, again, not just something that wasn't done. It was something that would have been absurd and even contrary to the character, the national character of Canada. And yet this is what we've built on top of our government. This Prime Minister's office with so much power over their own, so much power over us, and we can change it. The good news is there is a party that is actually trying to correct this issue. That is the Green Party. Now, the other good news is I think the NDP would actually go for it. It's not in the high priority list of things that the NDP would actually do, but I suspect that it's still within their realm of possibility. If you vote for the NDP, it seems like you might get some action on this. So it's worth considering that. And then, of course, the other thing is that the things the NDP will use the power for are good things, right? And there's always that risk, right? That if you use the power available to in an office like, for example, the Prime Minister's office, that yes, we can get a lot of good things accomplished with it. But by doing so, we legitimatize it. And we really shouldn't in this case. The Prime Minister's office was better when they didn't have so much power. It was better when they didn't have so much information flowing into it, so much budget feeding it, so many people involved with it, so much power over the ministers of government that are elected to represent the citizens of Canada. And again, Elizabeth May goes into it. It's worth, I think in this case, listening to her on this particular issue. Now, in any case, this episode is getting a little bit longer than I thought it was going to go. I do have to work today, so I'm going to leave it there for the day. However, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please go to Subscriber Star, and I think it's just Subscriber Star Jeff Cliff, Jeff-Cliff, and please consider, it's not going to break me if nobody does subscribe, but it would be really nice if I had at least one person who found this stream and these episodes enjoyable. So in any case, I'll see you all next week with more stories and hopefully a guest that actually shows up on time, and we'll kind of go from there. Thank you for watching and listening. I'll see you next week.